Thought I'd stall for a few minutes since it seemed like a big rush of people coming in for the last couple of minutes. And I'm sure people will continue to comment. I'll just miss my opening remarks, and that won't be such a bad thing. They'll get to still hear from our panelists. I want to thank you for coming. My name is Jody Roberts. I work in the Center for Contemporary History and Policy at the Chemical Heritage Foundation in Philadelphia. I want to thank all of you. I want to thank our panelists who have not only shown up for this evening to share their thoughts and their stories and their memories and experiences with you, but also for all the time that they put into the interviews that we've been doing with them over the course of the last 18 months. It's a 2-hour interview, but it is now a 2-hour process, as they can probably attest. But that's what makes them so fun and so rich. And I want to thank the AAAS for letting us use this beautiful space. We have a wonderful working relationship with AAAS. Some of you came to a talk that Jessica Trevano and I did, Jessica from UMass Lowell back in November, which was a bit of a precursor to some of this, and based on a lot of what happened in those interviews and some of the research that we've been doing, this will be a lot different because you don't have to listen to Jessica and to me. Not that there's anything wrong with listening to either one of us, but you get to hear directly from these 5 people that we've been speaking with over the last several months. This project began with a single idea, again, about 18 months ago, that a reform effort that does not properly account for the origins and evolution of the statute will fail to address the essential tensions that are at the heart of the call for reforms. That is, if you don't properly understand the problem, how they emerged, your solutions aren't going to work very well. We wanted to take advantage of this unique moment in history when broad consensus exists that the black box of chemical regulation in the United States needs to be reopened to ensure that the system created roughly 4 decades ago can properly handle the changed and changing dynamics of the chemical enterprise in the 21st century. And when many of the key actors involved in the life of TSCA are available and still willing to share their experiences. It doesn't happen too often that you do both of those. This project started with one interview. In the fall of 2009, my colleague Kavita Hardy and I spent 2 hours with Terry Davies, listening to stories that created the context for the creation of TSCA. Over the subsequent 18 months, we conducted more than a dozen interviews that covered every decade and every presidential administration. But we're not done. We're still scheduling interviews, hopefully with some of the folks who are actually in this room, and including some others. And if we haven't talked to you and you're in this room and you have your story to tell, we can talk afterwards during the reception. And more interviews are being scheduled to fill in the richer life beyond the EPA. We have ideas of how to really get a better sense for all of the different actors who have been involved over the past few decades. The 3 ideas continue to motivate this particular project. 1, we believe that the interviews we have conducted are bringing new ideas to the reform process. This is one example of that. 2, in the course of building this project, we have compiled a piece of institutional memory of the EPA that otherwise might be lost. And 3, through the collecting of this contemporary history, spanning 4 decades and counting, we are creating a unique resource that provides a new perspective on the continuing evolution of environmental governance inside of the United States. As a research center, the Center for Contemporary History and Policy, we are dedicated to bringing these resources to those who can benefit from them the most. And tonight we're putting this institutional memory that we've collected on stage and in the flesh. Before we get started, I want to quickly go over the format of this evening's event, which is also outlined in the email and on the website that most of you probably visited, and that's why you're here. I've asked each of the panelists to introduce himself by offering what role or roles he played at EPA, to offer us a sense for what the most pressing issues of the day were, and to offer at least one success story from that time. I'll proceed with a few questions for the group and for individuals, and then we'll spend the remaining time, what I hope to be the bulk of the time, taking questions from all of you. And please don't be shy about using those microphones in the aisles. This is an opportunity for you to ask questions of our panelists. It's not too often you come to something and people don't have 15 PowerPoints that they'd like to show you. There are no PowerPoints other than the one that you're seeing right now. Everything else is very pink. There is one tricky part in all of this. Like our interviews, this discussion is an opportunity to interrogate the past. While some of our panelists have entered into public discussion about the reform process, some have not. And a few have not been involved in the issue of toxics since their time at EPA. And some may have current conflicts of interest. I think something that many of you in the room can probably appreciate. I ask that we all respect the many lives that each of the panelists lead, all of which is a polite way of saying if a panelist doesn't want to answer your specific question, that's okay. We should just let them do that. But I think it's a challenge back to you, because what that means is that you just need to be more clever in the way you ask your questions. There's a way to get the answer that you want if you frame it properly, and that's the fun of doing histories and doing interviews about the past. With that, I'm going to let my panelists introduce themselves to you, and we'll start here with Glenn Schweitzer.
You want me to take the whole introduction now?
Yeah, if you don't mind introducing yourself, that'd be great.
And then...
And answer your 3 questions, yes.
My name is Glenn Schweitzer. I joined EPA in mid-73 following a competitive civil service contest. I was appointed the director of OTS at the beginning. I left EPA and I left OTS in mid-77, and from 1980 to 86, I was the director of the Las Vegas laboratory of EPA. In 1991, I published a book assessing EPA performance in controlling chemicals under all legislation. In fact, the government's track record in controlling toxic chemicals, and we still find it on Amazon. It's hard to find, but still a few copies on Amazon. So I do have some documentation for what I'm going to say, and it's helpful if I thought back. When I joined EPA, I was given 4 tasks by the administration. First was to help shepherd TSCA through the legislative process and prepare the agency for implementation. It turns out that the TSCA that emerged in 76 wasn't that much different than what went in 73. By the time I had arrived, most of the heavy lifting had been done, and the tweaking of the legislation which I participated in, while seemingly extensive, in the overall picture didn't make much difference. But finally it was passed, as you know, in 76. On Section 4, we in effect set up the Interagency Testing Committee. Section 5, we gave a lot of attention to the pre-manufacturing notification process. We explored structured toxicity relationships and minimum test requirements and so forth. We explored SNUs. We did a good job, I think, of segregating the old chemicals from the new chemicals and defining the universe of chemicals. Section 6, we had a hit list of a dozen chemicals that should be controlled in some way, which we presented to the incoming administration. And in Section 8E, we actually were responding to a variety of health notifications. We didn't exactly know what to do with them, even though there was no legislation, but there was always the confidentiality issue. And in Sections 6C and 9, we had some experience in referring the problems to other people who had existing legislative authority. Throughout this whole process, there was always the conflict of, was TSCA to be an umbrella under which all toxics fell, or was TSCA to be a filler? Fill in those patches where nothing else would touch it. I always, I guess with bureaucratic instinct, said it should be an umbrella. Other people didn't like that position. My second task was to take care of the chemical of the month problem, and we handled about a dozen cases, I think, reasonably successfully, finding the right authorities or the persuasion to control them. The poster child, of course, was vinyl chloride, which is documented in great detail in my book. The third task was to improve the databases available to the agency and other agencies for controlling toxics under a variety of legislative authorities. First, we checked the regional data banks about what they're worth, and the answer was they weren't worth anything because those people hadn't discovered what the standard deviation is. We did do considerable effort, expend considerable effort in trying to use the cancer registries, and trying to make sense out of them and bring them together. On the toxicology side, there was considerable confusion about, and there always will be, about how you treat animal data. We did get involved in upgrading the National Center for Toxicology in Pineville, Arkansas. And the epidemiology data issue, we did use it in a variety of test cases, and in several cases it was the decisive factor in whether to move or not to move. My fourth task was to encourage better use of science in controlling toxics under various legislative authorities. I was a member of the EPA steering committee, and I think I was a pain in the neck to the safe drinking water people, the clean water people, the clean air people, the recreational circle, because we always raised the toxic issue. I guess our one success story was requiring that the benzene dye issue be addressed in a scientific risk assessment method, and we did the risk assessment, and that determined the level under the Clean Water Act. There are other issues, but I'll just skim the top. The fifth issue, which was self-generated, was to try to assess how serious the problem of dangerous exposure was around the country. There was a lot written about this, but there was very little facts on the table. I visited about 30 chemical companies, big and small, visited all the regional offices, and consulted with about 10 state regulatory authorities trying to get a handle on how big a problem was this. The interesting thing was after I left OTS about 5 years later, I went back and visited a lot of these same places, and I can tell you that the change was absolutely dramatic in Liver Laptosky. Those chemical companies really turned a very sharp corner, and it was like night and day going into these chemical companies, whether you were worried about testing, whether you were worried about what the board of directors were doing, whether you were worried about the staff capabilities to address toxics or whatever. It was an amazing experience. Now quickly, what do I think were our most important achievements? Well, the book says 3. Take care of the PCB problem. That was in pretty good shape by the time that the new administration came in. The CFC problem was my pride. We succeeded in putting out in one notice in the Federal Register regulations produced simultaneously by the Office of Pesticides, the FDA, and CPSC on the control of CFC aerosols. And while each of the agencies had to write their specifics, the general argument, the general rationale, the general approach was one text for all 3 of those programs, and we thought that was quite an accomplishment. That went in the Federal Register in early '77. The third one, the book says, we did a good job on pre-manufacturing notification, and my impression is that a lot of what we tried to do has fed through till today. But my personal opinion, now my opinion is a little bit different. What was our most important contribution, I think, was the risk assessment. We were the big pushers of risk assessment throughout the agency in those early days. A lot of people wanted to throw us out of their offices because they didn't want to get confused with what a carcinogen was, how many mice you needed, and so forth. But we pressed hard on that, and I think we did help set EPA on a good course in addressing risk assessment, particularly in the carcinogen area, and later other areas came in a good direction. What was my biggest disappointment? Well, I have to tell you, when the Costa team came in and essentially threw out everything we did and wanted to start over, I was disappointed. And the rationale I was given basically was the Republicans aren't pro-environment. And when I walked away from there and saw that 4 years of work had largely gone down the tubes, fortunately we had a few good people in place that they didn't fire, but a lot of the work which had been laid out in great detail was sort of pushed aside, and we'll do our thing the Democrat way. Well, I'm neither Democrat or Republican, but I can tell you that was a downer.
Thank you very much, Glenn. We'll just go down the line. This was very complicated because there isn't really a chronological order, because you've got people like Charlie who were just there forever. And playing so many roles, and Jim who was there and then left and came back, and you know, so people, it was confusing. So they've self-selected what order they want to set in, and we'll go ahead and adhere to that. Next we'll ask Charlie Auer to introduce himself.
I just took the aside seat. I started at EPA while Glenn was the office director. I started in August of '76, which was a couple of months before TSCA was passed and then signed into effect. And I worked for all of these other gentlemen and worked with many of the people in the room. So I was at EPA for 32 years, all of it in Toxics office. I started as a chemist in the Office of Toxic Substances. I participated in the development, and here's a real walk down memory lane, chemical hazard information profiles, or CHIPS. Glenn probably remembers them. These were concise assessment documents, which were prepared to begin the work of dealing with the chemicals, all the inventory, once inventory was created. I then moved into handling Section 80 substantial risk notices, did that for about 3 years. And then in probably the most important experience in my career, I was given the opportunity to be the chairman of the structure activity team, or the SAT, which had this, at the time, impossible task of evaluating these new chemicals for hazards and environmental fate and Pchem properties, and informing the judgments that EPA would need to make on those chemicals in determining whether a regulation was needed or not. I say that that was the most exciting time in my career. Totally new set of problems, new set of approaches that had to be developed essentially out of whole cloth and then be applied in a way that could ultimately allow EPA to deal with what became a torrent of new chemicals, up to 1,500 new chemicals a year coming through the office, say 10 years after the new chemicals program started. After my time with the structure activity team, I began to move into management and was a supervisor for metabolism and structure activity relationships group, supervised risk assessors, and then moved into more of policy and rulemaking. I was the director of the chemical control division with responsibility for test rules, new chemicals, existing chemical regulation, as well as, other than, say, PCBs, and Section 8 notices. I did that for about 10 years, and then was selected as the office director for OPPT. Interestingly, I started as a GS5 in 1976, and I retired as the office director. So I guess I view that as kind of a remarkable growth opportunity. As far as my role in general terms, it was chemist, it was policy, it was regulator, it was leader in terms of being the office director and setting the mark for the approaches, the budget, the policies that would be implemented more generally. As far as the most pressing challenges over my career, I would say developing an ability to assess chemicals using structure-activity relationships analysis, doing that in a way which was judged to be sufficient for purposes of supporting the control measures that EPA would require. And I find it interesting that the use of SAR has never been legally challenged by the industry. No PMNs have been, 5E orders or others have been challenged on the basis of EPA's reliance on structure-activity relationships. The other major challenges that I would point to, the lack of data that Glenn talked about. In my view, that's really the central failing under TSCA, was the inability to produce the hazard and exposure information needed to inform decisions. TSCA tools are difficult to use. I think that the HPV challenge and the inventory update rule are both very important developments, which, despite the TSCA tools, did create information that could be used at some level to inform decision making. Another major challenge concerned the perfluorinated chemicals, PFOS and PFOA. I think EPA should take particular pride in that set of issues. EPA was really the first organization to recognize the issues presented by PFOS and then PFOA and other chemicals in that class. This was first recognized by EPA in about, I think it was about 2000 or so. And within 10 years, I think EPA had largely dealt with at least the major issues associated with that chemistry. Needless to say, there are remaining uses and issues and exposures, but when you consider where the world was 10 years ago, you now have a level of understanding about the issues which are presented and the care that's needed in using these things. PFAS is largely out of commerce. There are significant new use rules in place to deal with that. And the PFOA 2010-2015 stewardship program, I think, has opened the door to responsible oversight of PFOA. EPA has also done, I think, a very good job in evaluating the alternatives that have been introduced into commerce to replace PFAS, PFOA, and the others. So I view that as really among the greatest of the regulatory successes, if you will, even though Section 6 was never used to deal with it. Chuck, take it away.
Well, you don't know how happy I am to be here today. A week ago, I was in the middle of an earthquake in Christchurch, New Zealand. 2 days later, flew out with the clothes on my back and my camera, but I was really glad when that plane took off. Now, I was spared just by good luck, maybe, but maybe it was Providence that said I could participate in this panel on oral history. And if you don't believe that, it's because you don't have enough faith in the value of oral history. And I'm a big fan of this effort here, and one of the reasons is that in my spare time, I'm the executive director of the Epa Alumni Association, and we have, at this point, 680 members, which represents about 8,000 years of memories of what happened when people worked at EPA. And I just believe that there must be a few of those memories which ought to be, you know, recorded and remembered and mined for their relevance. And so if anybody knows of any source of money to help do even more of this work, the EPA Alumni Association would be glad to try to find more alumni who have memories.
I did not prompt that.
So I want to talk about the time with TSCA. I did work in the early 70s with Glenn in the startup of the program, but Glenn didn't work. And so my real time with TSCA was coming back into the program after 15 years at EPA. And my job mainly in those 15 years before joining TSCA was, OTS, was supervising or writing regulations to control the hazards of environmental contaminants. And so I had a mindset that I was coming to the Toxic Substances program to do something about control of hazards. And of course, I don't have to tell you that when I really got into it, I had a rude awakening. I mean, I should have known from my earlier experience. What I found, of course, were 400 or 450, I think at the time, very dedicated and professional and skilled staff who were very good at collecting data and analyzing it, but I think really did not have the track record on controlling hazards that I would have expected, the public would have expected if they cared or noticed, and which the rest of the agency, I think, would have expected. So there was a notable exception to that, I thought, and that was the Pmn program. When I got there, I reached the conclusion that I think others have, which is that the very best and brightest in the office were handling that program. Unfortunately, it was a secret program, so the public didn't really know what was going on. And that there wasn't much I could do about it to make any contribution, mainly because, of course, as we all know, the major impediment to that program is the lack of a requirement to send in data or produce data for it, which, of course, is part of the congressional design. So I thought it was probably a good success program story, but and I certainly sincerely hope that that's true, but I do want to say that in all honesty, I can't really be sure because I think it's too soon to tell. Maybe Charlie would want to comment on this. We have not heard what each of us are going to say today, because I think in a way one needs a robust chemical control program that does the risk assessment and then the controls to figure out whether in fact existing chemicals in the market, including the ones that we approved as new chemicals through those years, are in fact, I'm going to use the word safe, but if you just forgive me for that, are safe for the public. It's a little bit more complicated than that. I decided not to focus on the Pmn program, but as a regulator, I decided that I would, like a moth drawn to a flame, I would go after Section 6 and see what we could do to really make a difference in terms of control of chemicals. And I knew that working in a conservative administration as I was, and with a very active Office of Management and Budget, in reviewing those rules, that we needed a good horse to ride, and we needed to do a very thorough job to really make a strong Section 6 rule that was not mandated, on a chemical that was not mandated by Congress and essentially told us what to do. And so it was a pretty simple choice based on 5 years of work that had already gone on within the office to choose asbestos as that horse. And I think without danger of too much danger of contradiction, I would say that over the next, during this 5 years and the following 3 years, we did more analysis and a deeper analysis than probably has been done on any other consumer product in order to write that rule. We spent about $5 million and overall spent maybe 8 to 10 years doing it. As you know, the story is, of course, that rule, as much work as we put into it, was overturned by the court. And you now know that I must not have been a very good lawyer in helping the staff develop it, because I did imagine all kinds of challenges to the rule, mainly from OMB and from the people above me in the agency. But I really did not anticipate the kinds of what I have to say I believe was outrageous reasoning by the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals in the corrosion-proof fittings case that overturned the rule. I didn't foresee that the court would require us to do a cost-benefit analysis on every alternative as we tried to show that we were choosing the least burdensome measure. We did do lots of economic analysis. In fact, I held up the rule for a year to make sure we had enough analysis so we could get through Art Frost at OMB. But, and he in fact wrote a article later, said that was one of the best pieces of analysis he ever saw. But the court said, and of course it was correct in this regard, that we did not do a cost-benefit analysis of every alternative, such as labeling the products or whatever, instead of banning them. So instead we worked on doing the cost-benefit about which chemicals ought to be added to the ban. So we obviously didn't focus correctly. And I felt that, I have to say, I'm trying to report to you how I felt in 1990 and 91 when this came through. This is part of the history. That I felt the court had really overstretched its reading of the Act to require us to do that much detailed analysis. But in contrast, turning to another part of that court case, I did foresee that we would be held accountable for making sure that we were not simply banning a product and allowing the substitute of equally or more hazardous chemical in its place as a substitute. So we did worry a great deal and analyze, in my mind, in my view, the substitutes for asbestos, and we took this responsibility very seriously. So when I read the court decision, if you're familiar with it, you can see that I was outraged by what the court said, which was basically we didn't do the analysis, and I felt that we were falsely accused. So you won't be surprised that I was felt fervently that the agency should appeal this decision in order to set the record right, and hopefully to maybe move back the interpretation of the court with regard to the depth of the analysis that would be required, particularly on the least burdensome issue. So, but as you know, the court, I think you should know, I think everybody here probably knows a lot about this act. The agency did not appeal, and the effect of that ruling, I think, is what the interesting issue is, and I can only speak to some of this, and maybe the others, including the audience, can speak to it too. But my sense is that the effect was devastating, and even more devastating than I anticipated in arguing for an appeal. The other day, just to sort of bear out to see whether this is still true in 2011, I went to the EPA website to see how the agency describes TSCA, and I think it's a very informative thing. Not that websites necessarily reflect reality, but they are at least one window into it. And here's how EPA's website describes the authorities of TSCA. The Pmn Program, Section 4 testing, SNRS, that's interesting. SNRS, I think, thanks to Charlie and others, SNRS have gotten up on the list in a high place. The TSCA inventory, importing and exporting chemicals, and Section 8 reporting. Where's Section 6? Well, they did mention PCBs, asbestos in schools, and lead-based paint. So I give them that credit, but that's really not Section 6. So Section 6 has disappeared from the Act, and at least figuratively. And I guess I have to tell you that, taking my view of in 1990, I think that was a mistake. Besides the public health implications of that, which is hard for us to sure, I do think it's hard now to make a decision about how to reform the statute when we have really only one major detailed case, in this case asbestos, to shed light on how well that statute works and how it might be improved. So I think that's a problem, particularly since it costs so much money, and it was really not. I told Art Frost, okay, you got $5 million and 10 years worth of work on this one, but you're never going to see us do this much work again. I didn't know how truthful that was. Okay, so I'm going to finish up by just saying that Jody asked, what was the big success while you were running the program, and if you'd asked me right as I walked out the door, before the corrosion fittings case came down from the court, I would say, oh, we banned 94% of the asbestos products on the market, showing that Section 6 is alive and well. But of course, that's not a success story anymore. And I think now, looking to say, okay, what was the success of the program? It's probably indicative is that my choice today would not be the implementation of any section of TSCA, but in fact the toxic release inventory, which, as you know, is a separate statute, and that is a case where the staff did once again an excellent job of implementing it, and that one hasn't been overturned in court yet, although it's had its ups and downs. So I could say a lot of things about TRI and how it might relate to how we do or do not have NGO involvement in the TSCA, but I'm going to stop here because I'm taking up people's time. So, thank you.
Thank you, Troy. And now we go to the follow-up questions. Not that defines you. You were there.
Well, I was in the TSCA world for 6 years, and I'm probably the only one that started that as primarily a lawyer. I was in the Office of General Counsel in 1988, became the Associate General Counsel for Toxics and Pesticides. And I spent a lot of time looking at TSCA the statute as opposed to TSCA the movie, which I experienced later. But TSCA the statute is a very complex and actually innovative, at the same time strange statute. It's a hybrid of a lot of different things, which we could perhaps talk about at this point. As a good OGC person, my role, though, of course, was to expand and maintain the authority of the agency, and that took the form of litigation related to various testing authorities. We won one and lost one that turned out to actually be very helpful overall to the authorities of Section 4. And then I was responsible, I think I was actually more responsible for the legal defense of the asbestos rule, which of course didn't do so well. But we had quite a lot of work to do there, and that was a big part of the time we spent. And then in 1990, I kind of stepped through the looking glass and went in and ran the Toxic Program. Just to give you a sense of what that was like, let me describe some things that happened in my first year. First of all, we got the decision in the asbestos case, which I've been involved in, and we lost big. And it was a gut shot to the program in many different ways. But in addition, we were in charge of the TRI program, and therefore were accountable for expanding this budding idea of public right to know. And we were, a lot of people had ideas, and we were hit with many different suggestions about what to do. Then we were also told that we were going to be in charge of the pollution prevention program at EPA. So a whole new group of people came into the office. This brought in issues like we became in charge of we were the EPA liaison on things like green procurement in the federal government and the FTC's guidelines for environmental claims. So it's a fairly broad mandate. Then our friends in the enforcement office brought us under something called the CAP program, Section 8E, a voluntary program to bring in a lot of new studies under Section 8E. We had been processing maybe a couple hundred a year, and we got 10,000 of those that came in through the CAP program. In addition, we were working on budding ideas of how to regulate biotech, lead, and how to deal with the high production volume chemicals. Now, with all that, I would ask you, if you're in that position, would you want to leave right away, or would you want to stay around? I think it's fair to say that the biggest challenge of that time was simply the problem of creating coherence and some sense of connection and really managing change. This is an office that went through a lot of change. Policy functions went in many different directions, and kind of getting that to come together in some way was quite an interesting task, I will tell you. And so I think if there was an accomplishment, is I think we were somewhat successful during the 4 years I was there, I left in '94, in creating some coherence in some of those programs. And I think more broadly, I think it's during the time when the folks that worked on the TSCA program became more aware that they needed to think about a chemical program. It was actually more multifaceted and went beyond simply the administration of TSCA. And I think that's still there today. Things like the Design for Environment program, which started at that time, the green chemistry effort, which started during that time, are still at work. And I think that's been successful, not so much for me, but for the many people who work so hard on these things.
Okay, thanks, Mark. I'm one with a little bit of a different perspective because I'm the one official political hack here on the panel, being a political appointee, at least in my most recent incarnation at EPA. And I think, although I think it was close, Chuck had said you started out as a GS7. I started out as a GS4, which is lower than dirt. In the civil service, in what is now, OCSPP. I think most of us still call it OPTS, but we'll try and forgive that error. Started out just as a summer intern in pesticides, as it turned out, but that was relevant because then when I went later to start doing some graduate work, I was on another obscure civil service element, although civil service is more in the news, a Schedule P appointment, which is allows exemptions to be basically a graduate student that was allowed to be on soft money. And the reason that's relevant is, as someone who knew a little bit about pesticides, I was part of the front office when TSCA was very, very new in 1979. And it was the shiny new tool in the shed. It was fun, it was exciting. They were hiring people, everyone was new and stupid. And there was, and I don't mean that harshly, but just, everything was new. So what do we do? What is what is this? What is a new chemical? Oh, the good news is the inventory got done. Yay! Oop, 6 months later, the first PMN is going to come in. And we were all waiting around the mailbox for that first PMN. And it didn't happen for months, a couple of months, not forever, but people had shoved everything into the inventory in order to then make sure the bureaucrats didn't have to screw around with it. So finally one came in, and then the whole place jumped on it, and poked and prod like in the movies where the alien is discovered and things like that. and then there was like, now what? And then that's partly the background story of the SAR story, as Charlie outlined in much more hygienic detail. And then I was on the Hill. I was at the Congressional Research Service, and I was sort of the desk officer for TSCA and FIFRA throughout the 80s, and helping support the hearings held on TSCA from various congressional members, which of course amounted to about 6, and which has been part of the problem, in my opinion, about the TSCA implementation over time. That's congressional attention, for lack of a better word. A lot of reasons for that, and some other things, again, all kinds of things that we might want, some threads out there we may want to get into a Q&A. Towards the end of the 80s, I was then also back on the Hill properly with Mike Sinar's Oversight Committee in GovOps, and we held some more TSCA hearings. Sinar's committee was one of the committees that actually held regularly some large amount, relatively, of the TSCA hearings over time. And then, kind of in the put up or shut up world, when Bill Clinton was elected, I then got a political appointment back at OPBTS, being what's called the Associate Assistant Administrator, later closed out as an Assistant Administrator. During that time, and that's especially then when actually, at least on paper, being part of the management chain, being in charge of implementation, had some other sort of insights, and sort of like what Mark just said, how do you ride the beast? How do you manage the affairs? Jody's questions, to, at least I think to all of us, or versions of this, were sort of what worked, what didn't work, what was high and low points, kinds of things. And for me, in terms of the question, the biggest challenge was always, are we doing enough? There's always a question of, are you giving enough time and attention to the program? Obviously, you're always overtaken by events and those kind of positions. You've got limitations on literally your time, energy, resources. Budget was always an issue. This was a relatively small program. I think the high point of the program resources is probably like 79 or 80 before the first Reagan budgets came in. And I don't even think they're anywhere near even those levels today, 30 years later. But again, we could have done that, right? We're the Democrats, really good guys, and we didn't. Now, why was that? Well, partly because, again, overtaken by events and things. Two things happened. One was in '94, we were starting to have some hearings. It went to Senator Reid, who was then the subcommittee chair with jurisdiction over TSCA in the Senate, to suggest we might want to start, however to put it, tentatively, start to think about TSCA amendments. But then this guy Gingrich came in '95, so we kind of knew that wasn't going to happen. So then what do you do? And in the interview I did with the foundation, partly it's, well, you got to do what you can. Hit them where they ain't, and things like that. So you ended up with more voluntary programs like HPV. You ended up with TRA expansion. Separate story about how TRA expansion really happened. Partly. Someone else had said things, I guess Glenn, about, gee, Democrats came in, you couldn't do anything the Republicans did no matter what. Well, we had a version of that. We couldn't call it 3350 because that was a Republican idea, so we had to call it something else. Even though it was fundamentally an extension of the 3350 program when we went into the TRA expansions in the 90s. But again, the biggest challenge is, are you making sure you're not missing something? You got to make choices. You have whatever these contextual elements you've heard about that are maybe in the way, but are you making sure that there's not some big uppy chemical out there that's causing real harm? Because if you really thought that, staff, we'll go figure out a way to do it. We'll run back up the hill of Section 6, we'll go around the sideways, we'll just do a press release and say bad things about it, whatever it is, but what's out there. And basically the feedback throughout this period was, well, there's always more we could do, but we think we're doing okay. I'll leave it at that. We can get into more detail any other time. And in effect, that was always one of the biggest challenges. Are you sure? Are you really trying to make sure that you're, in effect, doing your job as a regulator and as a civil servant, public servant? The other thing would be, again, look at the history of this program. FQPA happened in 96, I'm sorry, in 96. Well, then FQPA became, the pesticide program, tolerance free evaluation became the shiny new tool, and the thing that had to suck resources. It got some maintenance fee money even starting in the late 80s. Had some other fees coming in at that point. And so that's what took your time at the political level, at the senior management level, in terms of what was going on inside OPBTS. Major achievements, well again, TRA expansion. Ironically, it was probably directly due to Mr. Gingrich's ascent. Literally, when you may or may not recall, right after Gingrich took over, excuse me, the Republicans took over the majority in 1995, then President Clinton gave a comment somewhere at some press thing that said, the president is still relevant. Thanks for that reminder, as constitutionally. And so then the call went out to all the political folks and all the agencies to go look presidential. Okay? And one of the ideas was, well, we can expand TRI. And in fact, the sub-story about that is we then had to go find a belching smokestack, which is kind of hard to find given modern air standards. But we needed to find a nearby belching smokestack, which we found in Baltimore, which is mostly steam, if you look. Not like you know that. We had to put it at the right angle, and the president helicopters in, gets a speech, and we then go off. And then the panel, a little bit before, was talking about some of the OIRA wars over time, and one of those there was they were still trying to screw out the speech as the president's in the helicopter coming into Baltimore. But I won't name names beyond that. The other, again, is Charlie, I think, mentioned some of this too, is VSEP and HPV. Again, if we got to call it voluntary, try and call the cards in. If people are saying there's lots of data and you just don't understand, maybe there's certainly CBI problems about where they can disclose, but okay, let's put out all this information. Let's make public what we can. Let's assess what is available and reassure not only ourselves but the public about the safety of products in use. I think that's it because I want to try and get to questions so that you don't all fall asleep. My role at EPA, my quick and dirty response to that is my role at EPA was color commentary, in case you couldn't tell already. But I did have some more serious roles and was always very appreciative of that throughout my career. I'll leave it at that.
Very nice, thank you. I literally have about 20 questions, but I'm going to take 2 from my list. So I want you to, while I'm asking those 2, to start thinking about your questions and start heading to the mics if you're interested. And I'll direct them at the panel generally, so whomever would like to weigh in can. And they try to touch on the different themes that you covered here. We can go back all the way, starting with Glenn, who starts saying some of this, and the others don't say this explicitly, but they might in terms of the practice of what they were doing. There was a sense at the beginning that, so TSCA is very different, right? It's coming into the context of the EPA at a time when many things are new. So that's funny, it's going to be a little bit like a kid at Christmas, so there's all kinds of new toys, and each one shinier than the previous one. But it's very different also, and one of the big differences is that it doesn't deal with media explicitly. And the way that Glenn put this was, and we've heard from others, that TSCA was imagined to be a queen statue. It was to be an umbrella. It was to address and give coherence to everything. And yet in practice, that seems to have quickly become TSCA as gap filler. And I wonder if you can offer any comments about your thoughts on both the challenges and experiences you had there that are indicative of the ways in which that concept changed and whether or not that conceptual frame changing really mattered.
Did you ask me a question?
I did,
Okay.
yes.
Well, I would comment that the only success in that area in terms of making it overarching is the risk assessment business. The agency started to have a consistent way of assessing risk, and in my time was all about carcinogens. And I think that standard approach to risk has been pursued till today. Aside from that, I don't think anyone bought into the idea that TSCA was somehow an umbrella under which their program was to be hung.
Yeah, I would agree with that. In the panoply of government agencies, EPA is really not at the highest tier. And I know that from my experience at high-level meetings at CEQ or OMB, you kind of sit on the periphery and talk after Commerce or Treasury or OMB or any of a number of others have spoken. I think Section 9 of TSCA, the way that it's structured with the formal recommendations where you have to make will present an unreasonable risk determination in order to make a formal referral. When OSHA, the recipient of the referral, has no idea what unreasonable risk might mean in context, of its statute and would ignore those aspects anyway. I think TSCA was really preordained by virtue of the way it was structured to be a gap filler, which is not to dismiss that role. There are unique authorities, test rule authority, the broad information gathering authority that you have under TSCA, new chemicals. Those are all unique and very valuable authorities, but they're really filling in gaps that otherwise exist.
Just before Eric goes to a question, the other thing I'd add about context is back in the end of the 70s and even through the early 80s to recognize, and Glenn talked about this a little bit, risk assessment was a brand new thing, whether it be just be carcinogens, now expanded into other things. The media programs otherwise, to my observation, were always more pollution is, bad things, and we want to minimize it as opposed to doing what we would now call risk assessment and whatever endpoint of concern. And that was cancer, again, as mentioned, very seriously. But all the risk assessment policies between toxics and pesticides, most of that risk policy, cancer policy assessment, for example, is all, to my eye, has been developed originally back in those days, in the early days of, again, what was OPPTS. And sometimes that's surprising. It was before the modern legislation, relatively modern legislation on neurotoxics and other things. And so that the history of how to do it, to have those concerns, a lot of that comes in pesticide hearings too. Mark and I did a 10-second sidebar on that, but back in those days, all that was new cutting-edge ideas and just cutting-edge issues.
Anything to add? My last one. Going back to lineup, that's good. Most of you have mentioned this, but you've used different phrases. That one of the difficulties you faced as the office director was managing change, was dealing with external forces, was being overtaken by events. I wonder if you can comment about how much of that has to do with the way in which the statute is phrased and how much of that has to do with internal organizational dynamics.
I would mention one part of that is in terms of the external pressure, I'll define broadly to include things like your boss, like assistant administrators. This is a statute that doesn't have an agenda, very clear. And I think it's always been viewed, at least initially, was, wow, we can do anything. But if you don't have an agenda, it's very difficult to stay on course. And the difficulty, I know I've seen both when I was there, but also, frankly, watching the program after. You often have different assistant administrators, different leaders come in with an agenda. You always have constituencies with agendas that they want you to change. And so what you end up doing is expanding the range of things that you can do and sort of people think you should do to the point where you have no agenda. And when you don't have an agenda, you can't manage it. This is a program that actually, when it has a fairly clear agenda, like in chemicals and PCBs, actually performs fairly well. But the absence of agenda and a constantly shifting agenda has been a huge political structural problem that goes to the statute to some extent for this program.
I would just add, this was a major frustration to me in running the program, comparing it to my experience of running the AIR program and other programs in the agency before I got there. I mean, I had a hard time being able to tell anybody what the mission of the office was. And the reason that's important is, I mean, how much resources, just within the toxic substances, how much resources should the new chemical program get compared to the testing program compared to Section 6, compared to Section 8? Well, if you don't have an overall mission, there's no rational way to make those decisions. And so you have a bunch of boxes which are running independently. And then when you go up to your boss and say, I have this great gap filling statute, will you please give me a big budget next year? And he says, I didn't know I had any gaps that needed to be filled. So I think it's a major failing of the statute in that regard.
And I would add into this, I think another aspect of this was the general lack of congressional interest or oversight. Jim mentioned the handful of hearings that were held over the years. It was hard to tell that the Congress cared, and so you're wondering what's important. You're not getting much feedback from the Congress. Really, other than NRDC in the early years when they filed all those lawsuits against Section 4 rules that Marge mentioned, or EDF in the late 90s, there was really little interest from NGOs or states. So the only people that EPA heard from were the regulated industry. And I think that particularly in a statute which does not have a set of mandates where the law says thou shalt, it becomes very difficult to figure out what's really important and how you should be focusing your time and attention. And I agree, PMNs took the lion's share of the attention for many years. Why? They showed up every week. You had to deal with them. You had 90 days. You had to take a decision. So for probably a decade, the attention was just sucked up by this throughput that kept coming in, and anything else you'd have to find the energy to do, because seemingly the Congress didn't care whether you did it or not. NGOs didn't care, and if you tried to write a Section 4 rule, or God forbid, use Section 6, the industry cared, and a lot. And not the way you wanted them to care.
Well, and if you, as you're sitting there across the table from the industry representatives who are telling you how much it's going to cost them and how they don't want to do the work, and you're saying as the director, but we need to do this, they're looking you in the eye and saying, why? Who's asking you to? And in fact, no one is asking us to.
Let me give another perspective. When I was in Las Vegas as the director of that lab, which was more or less the crisis response lab of EPA, where we were called to Love Canal, where we went to Dallas, lead problems. We went all over the West Coast, all over the East Coast, always focusing on chemicals. Every regulatory office in the agency, except the noise office, and TSCA, talked to us once in a while. But in my total tenure in Las Vegas, never did my telephone ring from TSCA. And even when I was in Washington, I couldn't even get appointments with the TSCA office. I think that it was inward looking to me rather than outward looking. It wasn't really trying to understand the national problem with toxics. They maybe did a good job on the PMNs and the regs they were responsible for, but unlike every other office in EPA, and we dealt with them all, apparently they didn't know we existed, and unfortunately my guys didn't know they existed. But we prided ourselves in how we could support the water, the air, and the regular circuit offices, but not TSCA. And that was, we were down there measuring chemicals, trying to figure out where they were coming from. And we were testifying in court. All my guys were going down testifying about docks in Missouri week after week. And unfortunately, we somehow didn't have a connect with Washington TSCA.
Thank you, David. Hi, Eric Olson. I was the co-chair of the trust and a former EPA-er. There seems to be something of a political consensus that TSCA needs to be reformed, from American Chemistry Council with Cal Dooley all the way to EDF and NRDC. Let me just ask, maybe we could start with Jim and go across. If you were Philosopher King and had two amendments.
I thought I was, Eric, but
well, you are.
had this chat.
Kind of hard to have 5 Philosopher Kings simultaneously, but let's pretend. What would very succinctly, what would the 2 amendments be that you think are most important to make the TSCA, to actually make it a functioning statute?
The 2 most, I do think, and others could write volumes about corrosion fittings, but obviously, certainly the way, not just, sort of, you already heard from all this panel, which is a pretty bright panel. Corrosion fittings need to be fixed just to be able to do something. I think that the other thing, if I got 2, it's sort of a tough call between some version of the testing, some kind of testing mandate, and here in this panel, just even right now, you've got some question about having again, you don't want to have too many mandates, but you need to have something to drive testing other than just say, go test things that deserve to be tested, because that becomes a circular problem we just heard about. My own view too is that you can live with a standard. Maybe this is a way to address, if I'm allowed to put this under the corrosion fittings fix. I do personally think, I worked a lot on FQPA, quite a lot on FQPA legislatively in my time at EPA, and you know, the standard, you can have an unreasonable certainty of no harm standard. If nothing else, what's the alternative? Unreasonable certainty of some harm. But you can, there's obviously a whole lot of things that go with it, as the lawyers in the room would tell you about exactly how you would say what is the record that needs to be developed in order to meet that standard and all. So if I'm allowed to say unreasonable certainty of no harm for the standard as a fix to corrosion, and I can do some testing things, those would be my two things of my list. And since I got the good and sexy one, since that went first. So, Mark, you're up.
I have to be careful here. So, but I would say this. I think really very much along the lines of what Jim is saying. The perception that TSCA doesn't work because of Section 6, which I'm not sure is exactly right. I think it's a little more complicated than that. But I think as just a purely political matter, there has to be some way of addressing that. And talk about the specifics of the standard and how it's done. But I think there has to be a sense that there is a viable capability to take a regulatory action on resistant chemicals. And that's true whether you don't use it very much, but you have to have the notion that power is there. The second thing I would emphasize, which is the point we just talked about, which is an agenda. Some way of creating a priority set of agendas that is what I would call a real agenda and not a menu. There is a tendency in some of these things to create a very long list of chemicals that's so large it's a menu that people can choose from. My analogy would be the National Priority List and Superfund. You have thousands of sites there. Some of those were put on the National Priority List in the 1980s. Well, it's 2011. They're still there. That's not an agenda. That's a menu of things you might want to work on. So I think you do have to have some notion of agenda, and it is a lot smaller than some of the things I've seen as proposals.
Mark said it much better than I could, so I'm going to leave it at that.
Yeah, I'll take the ones my friends here have offered. I would also say we really need to ratify and become parties to Stockholm and Rotterdam. I think that this represents a real failure of leadership internationally, and that if EPA is going to play the role, if the U.S. is going to play the right role, we really need to cure this defect.
I think the cut I talked about before, I would require an annual or a biannual report to Congress from EPA, because reports from Congress really get a lot of attention as they go through the system on the state of the toxic substance control in the country.
Thank you.
I'm Mark Dahl, in December of 1976, there was a public meeting about what EPA should do with TSCA. And one of the issues that was put out there was prioritization. And it talked about ad hoc decision making or having a plan, dealing with chemical of the day or plan. And then we had what we had with TSCA. My question is a follow-up to the previous discussion, which is it possible, given that we are where we are, and legislation is not going to be passed tomorrow, is it feasible for the agency to develop an agenda? Does it need Congress to tell it to worry about carcinogens or endocrine disruptors or whatever it is that might go into a prioritization directive from Congress? Why can't the program itself, or EPA, or the administration, decide what the agenda is for EPA? Or is there just a bureaucratic or administrative obstacle to doing that effectively?
Since I was there in December '76, I'm not sure which meeting you're talking about, but when we did present it, I thought it was in January, it may have been December, a plan. We had dates. We obviously had to comply with certain certain dates on certain regulations, and we laid it all out. And we had, for each section, we had timetables for the testing regulations where there wasn't a cutoff date. We had timetables for Section 6 regulations and so forth. And we thought we may have been overly optimistic, I must admit. But nevertheless, we tried our best, and then when the new administration came, they said, "No, forget that." And we must have had 1,500 people in that. It was one of the big auditoriums downtown, and we must have had 1,500 people in that auditorium. And I must say, my sense was we had a pretty good response. But so I don't understand why. I agree with you. Why can't EPA have its own time? Why must it? Now, I guess if the timetable is dictated by the Congress, then you got a little clout when you go to OMB, say we got to get these things out and so forth. But I think that's all about leadership.
Well, I would pick up on what Glenn just said at the end there about what schedules and deadlines do is let you not only have an agenda as Mark outlined, which is, we could argue why, again, can't you find your own agenda? I think Mark got your question in part. But with schedules and deadlines, what you have is that accountability. It draws attention from the outside interests, as others have mentioned about the lack of interest of not just NGOs, but Congress, all the above, all the other usual players in an issue set has been a problem for toxics over time, over this is the 40-year perspective. Number one. Number two, you've got, with schedules and deadlines, you've got an ability just as a program manager to go in the budget process at EPA. Even within OPPTS, you have this problem where, again, you've got deadlines and things going on in the new FUPA at the time, and yet, what are you doing over here? Obviously, folks like, Mark and Charlie, the residents at the time, do they have really good ideas about what should be done, what could be done if you had more resources? Great, but we don't have more resources. They got to go somewhere else. The deadlines let you also compete. The outside, you hate it in a sense, some of the outside, people nipping at your heels, but it's good medicine. Same thing like oversight hearings. But because you have to be accountable, it helps you go upstairs to your management, at whatever level, there's usually somebody higher up to then try and compete for resources, time, and attention. So all those things are part of it. But fundamentally, why not? Well, again, I think back to what Mark was talking about. If there's sort of no clear guidance, it sort of can fritter away. The other thing, looking at the historical perspective, is they're sort of episodic. So in other words, Glenn had said, and we sort of had a plan, and the new guys came in and said, by definition, we don't like the old plan because it's the old plan. We want to have a new plan because we're the new guys, sort of regardless of party at some level. I can testify that's certainly what happened in 93. The old guys in 92. Well, we're the new guys. We could have a new agenda. When Reagan came in, whatever happened in the early growing pains, and that's especially when I was in Jelinek's front office policy staff, just as a babe. But at the time, whatever fits and starts, trying to get early TSCA going from the 76 to 80 time frame, a lot of that was trying to figure out what carcinogens, and there was, shall we say, some question if we are going to be the umbrella thing, then that means we got to go, are we NTP, are we NIOSH? It's not just are we CPSC and OSHA, it's all those other things too, trying to do all that health chemical assessment stuff. The other thing that happens in the early days is starting to find your feet. Reagan comes in, budget goes down, you're not going to get any authority. You start to find your feet a little bit, Gingrich comes in. Again, I'm the sort of political observer of the plan here. And so then you've got sort of, again, there's more reasons for that whipsawing of the program or fits and starts of the program.
My response is I think probably all the people on this panel and others of us who are not sitting up here have tried to do exactly what you said. And I think it has all the problems that have now been discussed. But it does strike me that here in 2011, it might be more likely, might be more possible if both the NGO community and the industrial community decided that on a couple of propositions. Number one, risk assessments done under TSCA are probably more thorough and more scientifically sound than ones done at the state level or by Walmart or whoever. Now, that is not intuitively true, but they might conclude that. And then secondly, that maybe succeeding on a few things is better than doing lots of things. And if if there were, what I'm suggesting is there were some substitute for the congressional interest and the interest of the administration on up through the agency, which I think you won't find, then perhaps there would be enough to keep the TSCA program on course, to actually bring it to success and to accomplish things. And the more it accomplishes, the more it will be respected, the more will be expected of it. States won't have to do things which they'd rather have the TSCA program do, et cetera. So you might be able to get some momentum, but you're not going to get it, I think, from the Congress. I'm sorry, I'm not optimistic, and you're not going to get it from the administration, I think.
The instance that I would mention is the CHAMP program, which was really my attempt to apply the information that had been developed through the HPV challenge plus the inventory update tool, basic information, not perfect information by any means, and use that to sort through these thousands of chemicals where you could at least bin them. Not for all time, but at least initially. You certainly could go back as new information comes in. But that was my attempt to use the information that the industry had created. I thought that this was a way to really create a demand for further assessment work by EPA, further control measures. Unfortunately, this, like other actions that people have talked about, fell on the wrong side of the political equation. You know, when I considered whether it should be named or not, I thought about the HPV challenge. That was started under Clinton and continued under Bush. I naively thought that CHAMP, started under Bush, could be continued under Obama, but not. And I regret that greatly. Thank you.
Three over here. Hi, Jim Cooper with the National Petrochemical and Refiners Association. We'll try to bump it up to an even more philosophical question since the subject of modernization or reform or whatever has come up. Since you are all practitioners throughout the history of TSCA, I'm acutely interested in your opinion on this. Is there enough of a framework, a statutory framework, to go in and fix what exists, or do you think we really need to do the statute and start over from scratch as other regions have considered doing?
Jump in. I don't think you can ever start from scratch. That's the lesson of history, you know. You kind of have to stay with where you are. And I think if you look at most of the reforms that have been discussed, they're usually starting with a structure that's not that different. I think what the key point, I think, in terms of the structure is that, you know, you got to get something that is a manageable structure. And I think there are some things you can do under existing statutes, and there's some things that, even if you could, the political process of getting consensus that that is what you should do is very important. So I think there's some value in that kind of debate. And sometimes it may be that you don't have to change the statute so much in some areas, but there's the sense of that's how you should use this power for that purpose. And that's, I think, the value of that discussion.
Anybody else want to comment?
Again, I think, I don't, at some level it's semantics. Is it starting new or is it building on the old? But the fundamental question you've heard that most of the people in the room are somewhat familiar with the industry and the toxics program in general. You know, how do you pick chemicals? Which ones to test, how much testing, and get rid of the bad ones? I mean, the fundamental structure is quote, simple. It's just sort of, you know, now the proof's in the pudding. So some of the criticism of all this, the good news is we're all agreeing on principles, wherever we are. So any subgroup in town agrees on some set of principles. And that's good. That's better than the past. But now what? And that's a bit of the problem. And so fundamentally, the structure is there. You've got chemicals. You're going to be tested, which ones, how much, and then get rid of the bad ones, what's your stand, you know, and then suddenly all the other issues to make, you know, those four simple questions create a 100-page bill, 200-page bill, you know, obtain after that. Thank you.
Yeah, Herbert Stryker, Town Heckman. First of all, I want to congratulate the Chemical Heritage Foundations fascinating. I think you have to know your history in order to know where you're moving forward, and I really think this is a terrific program. You know, I would suggest, quite frankly, that in light of developments around the world, in Europe, in Korea, in Turkey, in Japan, it would be very difficult to say that TSCA doesn't have to be reformed in any way. They can simply do business if you provide more resources. I think dealing with the legacy of the past, the inventory of chemicals in some efficient way is going to be required. What I would suggest is rather than sort of focus on, you know, tinkering with the existing TSCA, just give it more resources to make it work, is really to sort of be smarter, look about what's going on around the world, be more smart, more efficient, you know, do things without putting as much burden on industry as is going on in Europe, elsewhere, and come up with a sort of a better mousetrap so that the U.S. version of chemical regulation will be the gold standard again, as it was in the 70s. And that's what I suggest. I don't know if that's a question.
I don't think it's a question. I was just glad you didn't say Libya. But when, as you're speaking, the one thing that made me think is derivative of Eric's first question, which was, okay, do it the other way, is, again, this is all pretty much a TSCA-noid crowd, which, you know, is high praise indeed. And so if you had only 2 pages, single space, in a set of amendments, that's it. The rifle shot, there's all kinds of words on the over, this kind of thing. But you can only change, not just 2 things, you only have 2 pages to do it. You can change 5 things, you can do it in 2 pages. What would you do? And that's sort of a useful exercise too, to force you as to what would make the most impact or be the most important too. Now, I don't have an answer to that question, but I just sort of leave that out there. And it's maybe something that, again, we, the community, may have to engage in the next 2 years, that there may be opportunities for rifle shots, or what are the simple fixes, or the, frankly, it's always like a nested set, because you can imagine if I only got 2 pages, if I've only got 2 issues, if I've got 5, if I've got a whole big group growth, then, you know, obviously you can come up with different things.
Yeah, I've already mentioned Stockholm and Rotterdam, which are just the most pointed examples of the failure of the U.S. presence. But I would agree that the way that TSCA has been bypassed has come at the cost of significant loss of leadership by the U.S. in bringing forward practical, pragmatic, workable ways of dealing with chemical issues. I know from my personal experience in negotiating the Stockholm Convention, there's a lot of regard around the world for the quality of the science and the integrity of the thinking that goes into U.S. actions. And the fact that we have a statute which does really not empower those actions and allow the U.S. to offer that kind of leadership, I think really comes at tremendous cost to the U.S. This is a global economy. You really don't want others setting the mark internationally for the U.S. We aren't the U.S. after all. Thank you.
Dr. Jamie Conrad, Conrad Law and Policy Council. Hi, everybody. You know, early on, both Glenn and Charlie said, well, gosh, you know, the problem with TSCA is we couldn't get enough information. But then later on, when people said, well, what are the problems? That issue hasn't come up as often. And I'm wondering, Glenn had also said, well, we started getting these 80 notices and we didn't know what to do with them. And I'm wondering whether, in fact, you know, with CHIMP, you had a fair amount of information, and you, with information gathering tools, you could get more. But I wonder if the solution, you know, and there's such emphasis on minimum data sets and more exposure information, no matter how much information you get, at some point, the hardest question is the last step of the step that Jim listed, which is, okay, which are the bad ones, and what is bad? In other words, where do you? It seems to me that as I listen to this, the fundamental problem with TSCA is there's not a numerical standard that says at this point you have to start restricting this chemical. There's only sort of verbal phrases which are endlessly kind of malleable, and so you could have deadlines. You could say 70 chemicals by, you know, in 2 weeks or something. But unless you've got, you don't have unless you've got some, seems to me, a number, which is X number of exposed people times some number of risk, which I guess gives you a number of kind of theoretical people. I don't see how the political or career people ever sort of know where to draw the line and say these chemicals are bad and these are not, and then it just becomes overridden by political issues and power.
Well, I'll take that a little bit. I mentioned the standard early on. And, you know, there's an awful lot of lawyers in the room from what I understand. And so, obviously, there's a whole lot of case law. I mean, I personally, unreasonable risk in the statute and current statute is relatively straightforward. You can argue whether that's risk-benefit, some other things. But that's relatively straightforward. There's case law about whether you use phrases like unreasonable certainty, no harm, and all that. But that's the guidepost for the sort of, you know, understanding the sort of what I would call the regulatory standard is to act or not. Corrosion fittings in the specific context is what you've heard about here, whether or not that puts on sort of not just an extra layer or a blanket or an actually, you know, a straitjacket on the ability to act. So I'll let some employers talk about it. We got a bunch up here alone, one out there. So.
Well, I was going to make a comment, but not as a lawyer. So. That's okay. Just as a reaction, I think to draw an analogy, when I was first starting at EPA, I spent a lot of time in a RCRA program. And that was a program that could have also regulated for a lot of different values, things you care about. It became a groundwater program. It decided at some point, this is what we're really worried about because it seems like the other things, air and water, are sort of covered. And I do think this one of the core issues with the chemicals program is to figure out what are the key values that you're most worried about that, for example, drive your priorities. One of the debates you have heard, that I've heard over time in the TSCA program is, well, this is mainly about worker protection because workers are the ones who are most likely to be exposed to chemicals first and have the greatest exposure. A lot about the new chemical program is about occupational protection. There's now a shift you're seeing more and more to be, well, it really should be about consumer products and the broader public. And as we get into issues of biomonitoring, what are the chemicals that are found in the body? There are all those kinds of things that are all very legitimate kind of frameworks for deciding priorities. But I think it is key that you have to, you probably can't do it all. Your head will blow off if you try to think about everything at the same time. So there has to be some of that value decision about what are the interests or endpoints, if you want to think about it that way, that you care about the most. That's one of the values of having a bit in a legislative context where that message is very clear.
The other point that I would note, I think HPV and SIDS is an established item of public policy. EPA's got the inventory update rule, which gives you basic information. They're now attempting to expand that reporting. That's stymied at OMB. I think to fully realize these things, you need the imprimatur of the Congress saying this is important for EPA to do. In doing it, it has to be workable and effective. You have to be very alert to the burdens which are presented. But I think that and Mark talked about consumers and all of the challenges, you know, there's a lot of interest in safer substitutes. Well, in order to judge a substitute, you need some basic information so that you're making a good decision. I think you also need that kind of a legal requirement for information to rebuild the confidence that has been lost over time.
I was watching a program on Jimmy Carter last night, and one of the criticisms of Jimmy Carter, valid or not, is that he got into the weeds so much that he had a hard time managing the whole program. And I think, in a sense, there is a problem when you work in the TSCA program that you know too much. You are seized with the immense universe that you're supposed to know about and deal with it. And it is innovating. I think that you end up not knowing where to go and you go nowhere. And I guess I would suggest, that's my first point. My second point is I'm skeptical of whether Congress will come to the rescue here. So if you're going to work without Congress, go with that scenario, I would say, in some sense, to my mind, it doesn't matter what horse the TSCA program decides to ride. It should pick one or two, not 15 or 20. It should ride the horse well and make a name for itself. It does not have a name. It's not a place where people look for solutions. If it could solve a few, show that it's active, can do something on controlling chemicals, to my mind, people would look to it as a place to go and solve problems, and that may in fact catch on. But at the present time, I don't think very many people look to the program office to solve any problems that they think are serious.
Thank you.
Before I sat down, because you hit the point on CHAMP that I was going to raise, that was an agenda-setting program, and we'll probably have to recreate it with a new name at some point because the legislation will be delayed. And Jim, you and I can debate deadlines sometime. I think they're an extraordinarily bad idea. But the question...
Very effective. Go ahead.
We can debate that too. But the question, I really do have a question, and that is, given that this isn't a pollution control statute, you're actually addressing a range, a huge range of products and uses that most of which probably don't merit regulation, and you've got to find those needles in that haystack. What are the right metrics? I don't particularly like the GAO metrics because they're bean counters, but what are the right metrics for judging a program like TSCA?
I think that's absolutely the key. And the lawyers like to say the number of regulations they have. I don't think that's the metric. I think the metric is exposure to dangerous chemicals going up or down, and is TSCA directly or indirectly influencing that. Let me give you one example. On Section 6, our initial target, immediate action in the early days was labeling. And we went over and suggested to DOT that we needed to coordinate the labeling. And by God, that put them on. They really took off like a horse race. And within 6 months, the labeling efforts of DOT were really impressive. Now, TSCA didn't put, there were no regulations under TSCA, but I think the TSCA sitting in the back room had an influence on that. And I think you can take CIIT, which I thought was a great innovation by the industry. That wasn't required by TSCA, but CIIT, for however many years it operated, I think did a great job. And I think TSCA can take part of the credit for that, because it was an alternative that the industry thought would work better, and the EPA encouraged them and so forth. So I think it takes a pretty sophisticated analysis of what's happening in the country to really identify the metrics that suggest whether or not this whole law is worth it.
Yeah, I would agree. I think it's a great question, but coming up with a set of metrics for this, given the diversity of the uses and exposures and the volumes and et cetera, I think is really difficult. I think human biomonitoring has a lot of potential, but that's expensive and brings issues with it. I mean, my personal view is that there's probably a core set of chemicals that need careful control. And for most other chemicals, either they're being handled adequately or they're just not toxic. And how you figure out what that core set of chemicals are and how you deal with them in a way to mitigate or to eliminate exposure where that's necessary, I think is really the difficult challenge that you have to confront here. And approaches like REACH, which just throw this umbrella over everything and then essentially try to brute force stuff, I just don't think that's the answer.
And laws belie some kind of political value system, and not to get too sort of haughty about it, philosophical about it. And kidding aside about deadlines, I mean, there's a good and bad about it. Anytime you put out a metric, whether it be number of chemicals tested or number of chemicals tested per year, month, decade, you got a downside. And you do have a substitution where the system, the program managers will say, well, if the law says, and I'm getting banged up in the budget process to make sure I've done 23 widgets, I'll do 23 widgets. Someone else can evaluate whether any of them matter in terms of real risk. But that's where the congressional guidance, I think Mark, to me, that's a derivative of Mark's comments about agenda, where the Congress is helping decide, again, is it going to be chemicals tested being one of those important metrics? Is it going to be some kind of other way to measure? Right now, with the OMB process and the budgeting, internal budgeting process, you've got other issues. The good news is you don't want to just be a bean counter. On the other hand, you say you don't know what you prevented. If you prevented through the Pmn program a bunch of big risks, how do you get credit for that? Either by way of OMB and the budget allocation process, or just by good public reaction to the fact that you guys are doing your job. You don't know what you prevented, and you, the society, does not, and also you, the Congress, don't understand that, and that just makes it partly hard to then explain why you're doing what you're doing.
All right, I want to get these last two questions in, and we're already a little over time, so each of you ask your question at the same time, but maybe if just one of you can draw straws to figure out which one of you wants to answer it, and then we can use that as fodder for while we're on the closed session. So we'll start then.
Good evening, Martha Marafis from Keller Heckman. And my question is, with the focus on reform on existing chemicals, the feeling that we missed something, that's my question to you. Do you think that the TSCA program missed something in existing chemicals during your tenure? And just a corollary question, in terms of prioritizing, if we do go back and look at existing chemicals here in reform, what are some criteria that you might have for setting those priorities instead of the broad brush approach that they're taking in Europe?
I think the other question goes
I think in my day, Mercury was one that was missed badly. I mean, it showed up in the fish, it was all over the place. And there weren't that many industrial processes that needed to be closed down. So I think that was a catastrophic failure.
It's very short, so if one of you wants to also comment on existing chemicals.
I think under current authority or under new authority, I think you have to deal with, I said it in my opening, central failing was the inability to create the hazard and exposure data needed to inform decisions. I think you need a way to deal with that. You certainly can't do everything at once, but I think if you have that, you at least have some opportunity to identify things that, at least based on, say, a SIDS level of testing, are an issue that would not have captured PFOS, PFOA. But you can't go looking for the unknown unknowns as your strategy. You just have to be alert to those when the evidence comes forward. And I do believe that it is not a common situation amongst industrial chemicals for things like PFOS and PFOA to be lurking. My guess is there aren't too many more like that.
Last question.
Thank you. Maybe we should have teamed up. It's a little bit in the same vein. I wanted to take advantage of, I should say, I'm Daryl Ditz at the Center for International Environmental Law. I wanted to ask a question about the new and old, which I think is one of the fundamental riddles of TSCA. Under other statutes, we treat new and existing differently, with the expectation that we eventually, the grandfathers pass on, and then we're dealing with sort of the new materials. But if you look by volume or if you look by value, our economy is still primarily dependent on the chemistry of 1975 and before. I wonder, in your experience and taking the long view, if any of you expected that TSCA might have changed the industrial mix of our society, or whether, as Charlie alluded, we kind of already have bad things out in the marketplace, and TSCA wouldn't fundamentally change the recipe of industrial society.
I would comment, maybe not directly on your question, this way. We as government bureaucrats often think that the main action is right there in the government. But the main action on chemicals is in the chemical manufacturing and use industry in this society. And what really needs to change in this country, if there are problems, is to change the way in which industry and the public, for that matter, interacts and handles chemicals. And the government is really a small piece of that. And the government, it seems to me, needs to be seen as an incentive. Your question brings to my mind, to what extent did TSCA influence the way in which industry thinks? And I'm not sure we really understand. But I would say that today, overall, TSCA is a paper tiger, and the chemical industry and the public doesn't pay any attention to it. So therefore, I don't think it's having any positive incentives, and it needs to. Without defining how big the problem is, certainly there are problems out there that could and should be solved by the industry and by the public without having to have a regulation.
Just to add a little bit to that, two things really. One is, I'm not a big fan of new versus existing as a distinction. It tends to get you arguing out the wrong things about what it means to be new, which is a fairly artificial discussion in many contexts. But I think the broader point you're raising about, have we made big changes? I think you have to accept the fact that existing chemicals that are deeply ingrained in the economy will be hard to get out of the economy. And that's true no matter what your regulatory context is. And so I think the question in all that is you would have to find some way, policy or legal, to figure out a way to say, we see the value of that existing chemical that we think is a concern, and we have some better ideas about what can substitute. And if you don't have that, I don't care what the framework is, it's not going to work. So that's a very complicated issue that I think is fundamental to any reform, however established.
Thank you very much. I'm going to give you one question that I want you to take out to the reception that you can ask these folks that I wanted to ask, but it will give you a reason to stick around and have a drink and munch something. I want to re-ask Eric's question, but with a bit of a historical bend, and say, if there was one tool you wish you had while you were doing your job, what would it have been? And all of you can go discuss that over a drink. Just make sure you tell me what the answer was. Thank you all so much for your time.
Two words, order the And I'm a different one. All right, Eric.